On April 11, 1951, President Harry Truman sat alone in the Oval Office, holding a single sheet of paper that would end the career of the most famous general in American history. And as he stared at his own signature on that document relieving General Douglas MacArthur of all his commands in Korea and Japan, Truman knew the political firestorm coming his way would be unlike anything he'd faced before. But what most Americans didn't understand was that this wasn't really about Korea at all. This was about correcting a mistake that Franklin Roosevelt had made years earlier during World War II. A mistake that had allowed one man in uniform to believe he answered to no one, not even the President of the United States. The story really begins back in 1942, when Douglas MacArthur was commanding Allied forces across the vast Pacific theater. And after his dramatic escape from the Philippines with Japanese forces closing in from all sides, MacArthur made his legendary promise to the Filipino people, "I shall return." And overnight, American propaganda transformed him into a living legend, a hero whose larger-than-life persona gave hope to a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt needed that narrative desperately, needed MacArthur's image plastered on posters and newspapers to keep American morale high during those dark early days of the war. But what the public never knew was that behind closed doors, Roosevelt was quietly losing control of his most famous general, because MacArthur had begun to believe his own press, started thinking he knew better than the president, better than the Joint Chiefs of Staff, better than anyone who dared question his strategic vision. The trouble started in July 1942, when Roosevelt and his military advisors made a crucial decision about how to win the war in the Pacific. They decided the main offensive should drive straight through the Central Pacific under Admiral Chester Nimitz, with MacArthur's Southwest Pacific campaign serving as a secondary front. And this made perfect strategic sense because the Central Pacific route was shorter, more direct, and would allow America to leverage its overwhelming naval superiority against Japan. But MacArthur violently disagreed with this plan, not because it was bad strategy, but because it meant someone else would get the glory of defeating Japan, and MacArthur wanted the main offensive to go through his Southwest Pacific Command, island hopping through New Guinea and the Philippines, even though it would take longer, cost more American lives, and serve mainly to make Douglas MacArthur the hero who personally liberated the Philippines and brought Japan to its knees. What happened next was unprecedented. Instead of arguing his case through proper military channels like any other general would, MacArthur went around Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs completely, giving interviews to friendly journalists who would print whatever he said, leaking classified information to Republican congressmen who opposed Roosevelt, and making public statements that directly contradicted official American policy. MacArthur told reporters that the Central Pacific strategy was nothing more than a Navy power grab, that only his strategy could win the war efficiently and save American lives. And he even implied that Roosevelt was making military decisions based on politics rather than what was best for the troops, which was essentially accusing the president of getting soldiers killed for political gain. This was insubordination that bordered on mutiny, the kind of behavior that in any normal chain of command would result in immediate relief of duty, a court-martial, and the end of a military career. But Roosevelt's response to all this was absolutely nothing. He was annoyed, certainly, complained to his aides that MacArthur was impossible to manage, but Roosevelt never disciplined MacArthur, never publicly contradicted him, never even threatened to relieve him of command. Roosevelt had made a cold political calculation that would haunt the presidency for years to come. MacArthur was simply too popular to fire, because Republicans loved him and saw him as a potential presidential candidate. The press worshipped him as America's greatest general, and firing MacArthur would create a political explosion that could seriously damage Roosevelt's chances in the 1944 election. So Roosevelt did what seemed easier at the time. He accommodated MacArthur, gave him more resources than military strategy actually required, and let the general have his way even when Roosevelt privately believed MacArthur was wrong. The worst incident came in 1944, when Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs had reluctantly agreed to invade the Philippines as MacArthur demanded, even though many of them still believed bypassing the Philippines entirely and going straight for Formosa made more strategic sense. But MacArthur had lobbied so hard and created so much political pressure that Roosevelt finally gave in. The landings at Leyte Gulf were scheduled for October 1944, and what MacArthur did next would make Roosevelt absolutely furious. Though once again, Roosevelt would refuse to punish him. MacArthur arranged a carefully choreographed publicity stunt where he would wait ashore at Leyte with photographers capturing every moment, delivering his famous "I have returned" speech for the cameras in what was pure theater designed for maximum dramatic impact. The problem was that MacArthur waited ashore hours before the beach was actually secure, deliberately endangering himself and his entire staff just to get that perfect photograph, and worse, he did all this without informing his naval and air commanders, who suddenly had to scramble to provide unplanned protection for the general's photo opportunity. When Roosevelt learned what MacArthur had done, he was livid, telling Admiral William Leahy that it was the most reckless, self-aggrandizing thing he'd ever heard, that MacArthur had risked his life and his staff's lives for a photograph, and what if MacArthur had been killed by a Japanese sniper? The entire Pacific Command structure would have collapsed. Leahy asked Roosevelt what he wanted to do about it, and Roosevelt's answer revealed everything wrong with how he handled MacArthur. "Nothing, we can't, he's too popular." It was classic Roosevelt, recognizing the problem, complaining about it privately, but refusing to confront it because of political considerations. MacArthur's insubordination continued right through the end of the war, and in March 1945, he even publicly criticized the decision to develop and potentially use atomic bombs on Japan, saying his ground forces could win without them if given proper support, which meant he was contradicting presidential policy and questioning the most sensitive military secret in American history. Again, there were no consequences, and after Japan surrendered in August 1945, MacArthur essentially crowned himself the American Emperor of Japan, issuing directives and making policy decisions that went far beyond his military authority, acting more like a viceroy than a theater commander. When Harry Truman suddenly became president in April 1945 after Roosevelt's death, he inherited this impossible situation. He inherited a general who had spent 3 years completely ignoring presidential authority and facing zero consequences for it. Truman, who had served as an artillery captain in World War I and understood military discipline from the ground up, was absolutely appalled by what Roosevelt had allowed, telling his staff bluntly that Roosevelt had let MacArthur run wild because he was afraid of the political consequences, that it was a mistake, and that civilian control of the military wasn't optional. It was constitutional, and Truman would not compromise on it under any circumstances. But Truman didn't act immediately because in 1945 and 1946, with World War II just ended and MacArthur overseeing the occupation of Japan, Truman judged it wasn't the right time for a confrontation, especially since MacArthur was actually doing reasonably well in Japan, implementing democratic reforms and managing the occupation with some real competence, and the political cost of firing him would be absolutely enormous when Truman already had enough problems rebuilding America after the war. So Truman watched carefully, waited patiently, and quietly documented every single instance of MacArthur's insubordination, building a case file he knew he might need someday. That day came on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces poured across the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea, and Truman, acting through the United Nations, immediately committed American forces to defend South Korea and appointed Douglas MacArthur as commander of all UN forces in Korea. It seemed like a logical choice at the time. MacArthur was already in Japan, knew the Asian theater better than any other American general, and was still the most celebrated military commander in the country. But Truman knew it was incredibly risky, telling Secretary of State Dean Acheson that he was giving MacArthur this command but watching him closely, because MacArthur had a history of thinking he knew better than the president, and if MacArthur pulled that with Truman, he would relieve him, regardless of how popular MacArthur was. The warning signs appeared almost immediately, and in July 1950, MacArthur flew to Formosa to meet with Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek without any authorization from Truman, and MacArthur's visit was interpreted internationally as an American commitment to defend Taiwan against Communist China, which directly contradicted Truman's careful policy of not getting involved in the Chinese Civil War. When Truman demanded an explanation, MacArthur claimed it was just a courtesy visit with no policy implications. But Truman didn't believe him for a second and let it go with a stern warning. Then in August, MacArthur sent a message to the Veterans of Foreign Wars Convention that openly criticized Truman's Asia policy and argued for a much more aggressive stance toward Communist China. And Truman was absolutely furious, ordering MacArthur to withdraw the message immediately, which MacArthur did, but only after ensuring it had already been published in newspapers across the country. It was calculated insubordination, appearing to comply while making sure the damage was already done. Truman told his staff that this was exactly what Roosevelt had tolerated from MacArthur during the war, that Truman would not tolerate it, and that one more incident would end MacArthur's career. The final crisis came in late November 1950, when MacArthur launched a major offensive designed to end the Korean War quickly, promising Truman that American forces would be home by Christmas. And MacArthur had assured both Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that there was almost no risk of Chinese intervention in the war. MacArthur was catastrophically wrong about this. On November 25th, over 300,000 Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River and smashed into MacArthur's overextended forces in one of the worst military defeats in American history, forcing American and UN forces into a desperate retreat down the Korean peninsula. MacArthur's response to this disaster was to blame everyone except himself and to demand a massive expansion of the war that would make the Korean conflict look tiny by comparison. He wanted to bomb China, he wanted to use atomic weapons, he wanted to deploy nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan to invade mainland China. He essentially wanted to start World War III. When Truman said absolutely not, that the United States would not expand the war into China under any circumstances, MacArthur began publicly and deliberately undermining the President of the United States. In December 1950, MacArthur gave an interview criticizing Truman's limited war strategy. Then in March 1951, he issued a public statement threatening China with expanded military action if they didn't negotiate surrender, which directly sabotaged Truman's careful diplomatic efforts to arrange a ceasefire and end the war. Then came April 5, 1951. The final straw that would end Douglas MacArthur's military career. House Republican leader Joseph Martin stood on the floor of Congress and read aloud a letter from MacArthur that criticized Truman's Korea policy and argued passionately for MacArthur's alternative strategy of expanding the war. Truman read that letter and made his decision in that exact moment. He called in his top advisors, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley, and Chief of Staff Averell Harriman, and Truman told them plainly that MacArthur had left him no choice, that MacArthur was publicly defying presidential authority, trying to dictate American foreign policy, and attempting to start a wider war that Truman had explicitly forbidden. The advisors were split on what to do. Marshall, himself a five-star general and the most respected military figure in America, strongly supported Truman's decision, saying that military officers don't get to make foreign policy. They don't get to publicly contradict the commander-in-chief, and MacArthur had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Omar Bradley agreed completely, saying MacArthur had forgotten that he worked for the president, not the other way around, and that this wasn't really about Korea strategy at all. It was about civilian control of the military, and Truman had to act. But Harriman, the political operative who understood how Washington really worked, warned Truman that this would be the most controversial decision of his presidency, that MacArthur was beloved by millions of Americans, that Truman would be accused of losing Korea, of appeasing communism, of firing a great general out of petty spite, that Republicans would destroy him and his approval ratings would collapse. Truman's response was immediate and absolutely firm. He told Harriman he didn't care about any of that because Franklin Roosevelt had let MacArthur run roughshod over presidential authority for 5 years because Roosevelt was worried about political consequences. And it was wrong then and it would be wrong now, and the Constitution said the president was commander-in-chief, not MacArthur, and Truman was going to enforce that principle regardless of the cost. Truman spent the next few days carefully reviewing every single instance of MacArthur's insubordination since June 1950, building an overwhelming case that even MacArthur's defenders would find hard to dispute, and Marshall helped by documenting everything from the military's perspective. MacArthur had disobeyed direct orders, had catastrophically misled his superiors about Chinese intentions and was now publicly advocating policies that could trigger World War III and potentially nuclear war. On April 9th, Truman met with his advisors one final time and asked each of them directly whether they supported relieving General MacArthur of command. Marshall said yes, Bradley said yes, the other Joint Chiefs said yes, Acheson said yes, and even Harriman, after hesitating, finally admitted that politically it was a disaster but constitutionally it was absolutely necessary, so yes. Truman said simply, "Then it's decided, draft the order." And the order was drafted that evening, brutally simple and direct. Truman deeply regretted that it became his duty as President and Commander-in-Chief to replace MacArthur as Supreme Commander Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief Far East, and Commanding General U.S. Army Far East, and MacArthur would turn over all his commands immediately to Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway. Truman signed the order on April 10th, and the plan was to deliver it to MacArthur through proper military channels on April 12th, giving MacArthur time to prepare for the transition and leave with some dignity. But on April 11th, a reporter somehow got wind of the story, and Truman's press secretary came to him urgently because the Chicago Tribune was about to publish that MacArthur was being fired, and if MacArthur learned about it from the newspaper instead of through official channels, it would be an additional public humiliation. Truman made a split-second decision: announce it immediately, right now, and at 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, Truman held an emergency press conference announcing that General Douglas MacArthur had been relieved of all his commands, and the reporters in that room were absolutely stunned. By dawn, the news was on every radio station and every newspaper front page across America. President Truman had fired General MacArthur, and the reaction was more explosive than anything Truman's advisors had predicted. Republicans were apoplectic with rage. Senator Joseph McCarthy called it the greatest victory the communists had ever won. Senator Richard Nixon said Truman had lost his nerve. Senator Robert Taft suggested Truman should be impeached, and newspapers across the country condemned the decision in the harshest possible terms. Truman's approval rating, which was already low because of the Korean stalemate, dropped to 23%, one of the lowest presidential approval ratings ever recorded in American history, and Truman received actual death threats as telegrams poured into the White House running 20-1 against his decision. But Truman never wavered for a single moment. In a cabinet meeting the day after firing MacArthur, he explained his reasoning with the calm certainty of a man who knew he'd done the right thing, telling his cabinet that he knew the decision was unpopular, knew MacArthur was a hero to millions of Americans, but the principle at stake was more important than popularity or poll numbers. Truman said that if he let MacArthur defy presidential authority without consequences, he would establish a precedent that generals could make foreign policy, that they could publicly contradict the commander-in-chief, that they could refuse to follow orders they disagreed with, and that wasn't how democracies worked, that was how military dictatorships started. Then Truman said something that revealed how deeply Roosevelt's mistake had influenced his thinking. He said Roosevelt had faced this exact situation with MacArthur during World War II, that MacArthur had regularly ignored orders, undermined policy, and put his own ambitions ahead of military objectives, and Roosevelt had done nothing because he was afraid of the political cost, and that was wrong, because it set a precedent that MacArthur could operate outside civilian control, and Truman was correcting that mistake now, and yes, it was costing him politically, but some things were more important than poll numbers. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome that seemed to vindicate everything he'd done. 7 million people lined the streets of San Francisco for his parade. He addressed a joint session of Congress giving his famous "Old Soldiers Never Die" speech that left many representatives openly weeping, and Republican leaders immediately began pushing MacArthur to run for president in 1952 to challenge Truman and vindicate himself. The national mood seemed overwhelmingly pro-MacArthur and anti-Truman, and it looked like Truman's presidency was finished. But then something interesting started to happen. The Senate held extensive hearings on MacArthur's dismissal, and for weeks, senators questioned MacArthur, the Joint Chiefs, and all of Truman's advisors about what had really happened in Korea. And the more MacArthur testified, the worse he looked to the American people. MacArthur came across as arrogant, dismissive of questions from elected senators, openly contemptuous of civilian authority, and he actually admitted under oath that he had disagreed with presidential policy and had deliberately taken actions to undermine it, confirming that he had wanted to expand the war into China and use atomic weapons against explicit presidential orders. Meanwhile, all the Joint Chiefs testified in strong support of Truman's decision, and General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, gave absolutely devastating testimony that changed everything. Bradley said that MacArthur's strategy would have involved America in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy, and he explained in detail how MacArthur had disobeyed orders, misled his superiors, and was attempting to dictate foreign policy instead of implementing it. Even Republican senators on the committee were visibly shaken by how clearly MacArthur had overstepped his authority and violated basic military discipline. Public opinion began to shift dramatically. People started asking themselves that if all the other generals agreed MacArthur had to go, maybe Truman was right after all, and if MacArthur was willing to risk World War III against direct presidential orders, maybe he was actually dangerous rather than heroic. MacArthur's approval ratings started dropping as more Americans realized he had been genuinely insubordinate and reckless, and by summer 1951, more Americans actually supported Truman's decision than opposed it. MacArthur's political career collapsed completely. He didn't run for president in 1952. He faded into retirement giving occasional speeches, but he was no longer a major political force in America, and meanwhile, Truman's decision to fire him became increasingly recognized as an act of real courage and principle. Historians began comparing it favorably to Lincoln's struggles with General McClellan, another general who had thought himself more important than the president he served. In later years, after leaving the White House, Truman often spoke about the MacArthur firing with the perspective that only time and distance can bring, and in a 1961 interview, he explained his thinking with characteristic bluntness. Roosevelt had let MacArthur get away with insubordination for years because it was politically easier than confronting him, but it was wrong and it created a situation where MacArthur thought he was untouchable, and when Truman became president, he decided he wouldn't make that same mistake, and when MacArthur defied him, Truman fired him, simple as that, because a general who won't follow orders isn't a general anymore. He's a threat to democracy itself. Truman also reflected deeply on what Roosevelt's mistake had ultimately caused, saying that if Roosevelt had disciplined MacArthur back in 1942 or 1943, if he'd made absolutely clear that generals serve at presidential pleasure and must follow orders no matter what, maybe MacArthur wouldn't have thought he could defy Truman in 1951. Maybe MacArthur would have understood that his job was to implement policy, not make it. But Roosevelt didn't do that because he took the easy path politically. And Truman had to clean up the mess years later. The firing of MacArthur established a principle that endures in America to this very day. Generals serve the president, not the other way around, and no matter how famous, how successful, how beloved a general becomes, the president has both the constitutional authority and the democratic responsibility to relieve that general if he becomes insubordinate to civilian control. Truman paid an absolutely crushing political price for enforcing that principle, but he never regretted it for a single moment of his life. The contrast between Roosevelt and Truman on this issue reveals something profound about both presidents and about leadership itself. Roosevelt was brilliant at many things and was certainly one of America's greatest presidents, but he had a tendency to avoid confrontations that might cost him politically, even when principle demanded confrontation, and he let MacArthur run wild for years because firing him would have been deeply unpopular with the public and with Congress. Truman, on the other hand, was willing to do what was constitutionally right even when it was politically suicidal, firing MacArthur because the Constitution and the sacred principle of civilian control demanded it, regardless of what it would cost him personally or politically. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower, himself a five-star general and supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, was elected President of the United States, and one of his very first actions was to visit Truman at the White House for the transition of power, and during that private meeting, Eisenhower personally thanked Truman for firing MacArthur, explaining that Truman had done what absolutely had to be done, that MacArthur had forgotten that in America's constitutional system, The military serves the civilian government and not the other way around, and that Truman had reminded everyone of that fundamental principle, including the military itself. Eisenhower told Truman that his decision had actually made Eisenhower's job as president easier because no general would ever again think he was above presidential authority or could defy the commander-in-chief without facing immediate consequences. Truman's response revealed just how much Roosevelt's wartime mistake had driven his own decision years later. Truman told Eisenhower that he had learned from watching Roosevelt let MacArthur get away with insubordination during the war, that Roosevelt was unquestionably a great president, but he had made a serious mistake by not controlling MacArthur when he should have, and Truman simply wasn't going to repeat that mistake because the Constitution wasn't optional and civilian control wasn't negotiable under any circumstances, and MacArthur had forgotten that basic truth. So Truman reminded him in the only way that mattered. The firing of MacArthur was ultimately Truman's way of correcting Roosevelt's wartime mistake, of establishing once and for all that no general, no matter how famous or how successful or how beloved by the public, was bigger than the Constitution of the United States. It cost Truman enormously in political terms in the short run, with his approval ratings cratering and his presidency seeming finished, but it preserved a fundamental principle of American democracy that transcends any single president or any single war. The military answers to civilian authority, and presidents must have the courage to enforce that principle regardless of political consequences, regardless of public opinion, regardless of what it might cost them personally. Looking back across the decades, Truman's firing of MacArthur stands as one of the most courageous decisions in the entire history of the American presidency. Not simply because MacArthur was strategically wrong about expanding the war into China, though he absolutely was, and not simply because MacArthur was insubordinate to presidential authority, though he clearly was, but because Truman was willing to sacrifice his own political standing, his own popularity, his own chances of political survival to preserve a constitutional principle that was more important than any individual, including himself. Truman learned from Roosevelt's mistake of avoiding confrontation with MacArthur during World War II, and Truman absolutely refused to repeat that mistake when his own time came, and that willingness to do the right thing regardless of personal cost is what made Harry Truman, in this instance at least, perhaps an even better president than Franklin Roosevelt, because Truman had the moral courage to do what was constitutionally right even when it was politically devastating, and that kind of courage is what true democratic leadership looks like when it matters most.